Eamon Ryan has 15 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Kirlick. Like a lot of people, I'm sure, in this House, in this country, were engrossed or this whole Brexit issue. I find myself reading The Spectator and New Statesman, The Telegraph and The Sun and The Mirror and The Guardian and listening to Radio 4 and Radio 5 Live and trying to understand, watching the House of Commons non-stop to try and just see what's going to happen next. I have a sense in this country that there isn't a kind of a big swell of anti-Englishness or kind of it's a slightly sad feeling and it's very uncertain. But our position, our attachment to this issue is a neutral one in a sense. We're not taking a nationalistic position in what's going on. I say that because among the things I'm reading, it was interesting, I was reading Newton Emerson today, a very good article in the Irish Times, saying a lot of stuff which is absolutely true in terms of the nature of the role of the Good Friday Agreement in this whole process and influencing our need for a backstop and so on. And technically, and I've heard other people say it, it's true, the Good Friday Agreement doesn't go into all sorts of fine details around customs arrangement or border control systems and so on. It was more of, in a sense, a constitutional arrangement. And I was thinking as later on this morning, as part of my ongoing constant feed of Brexit material, I listened to, was it Conor McGinn, in the Labour MEP from St Helens, who chairs the House of Commons, I think, Irish Committee, I think he said this morning, who was originally from the border area just north of Newry. And in a sense, he answered Newton Emerson for me, in my mind, by saying what I think is true, that the issue we're dealing with isn't just about the technicalities of trade, about what sort of documents and what sort of tariffs and what sort of technical arrangements, or indeed even to the extent about what sort of fishing quota allocations, or what sort of rules for airline systems. It is actually an issue broader, deeper, fundamental question of the relationships on this island and between this island and the neighbouring island. And I keep asking myself this question because I think it is worthy for us to ask, have we been right in this House, has the government been right to take such a firm position in regard to the backstop? Because I think it will be very important, there will be rightly questions asked, should there be a no-deal crash-out Brexit, where we end up with the worst of all arrangements where there's no backstop, and we've all the difficulties that Minister Ross seems to be grappling with in terms of what we would have to do then on the border. So it's right for us to ask the question, are we right in this insistence in saying we need, was Newton Emerson saying today that there was an issue of trust? We didn't seem to trust the UK government in this regard. I don't think that's where what I sense relatively united position on the backstop is coming from. I don't think it's a lack of trust per se, but I think it is, and at our core, as someone who voted for the Good Friday Agreement, that in that vote it was a very fundamental, substantial change in this Parliament, which has been here for 100 years, and as a people, that we made that commitment to say we cede our national claim on the territory, but we gain the recognition that Northern Ireland is different. And if at some time in the future, and we will not do it by coercion, we will not even do it by force of majoritarian numbers, I think, it'll have to be done in a way that's much more consensual and soft in its approach. But if at some day the North is to come back to join with the South, then that also is a possibility. And that's a subtlety. That's not a tariff rule or a customs arrangement rule. That's a very, very sensitive, subtle, but significant constitutional moment that we agreed to. And in some ways, I think, in what I sense in this House is a pretty much uniform agreement with the government in the position that's been taken. That's where it's coming from. It's not a distrust, it's not a nationalist position as such, but it's just adhering to that day when we voted for the Good Friday Agreement, that we abhor the use of violence in a Northern Ireland or in an Irish political context in terms of a claim on the North. but that we will not abandon at the same time those Irish citizens in the north who, because of that commitment we made, are going to be European Union still, no matter what arrangement takes place or what happens in the next 3 months. And it's interesting watching the House of Commons. It's interesting watching the kind of this daily amazing scenes. And I wonder, does that sort of subtle position here of acceptance and agreement on that, does it even sometimes have to do with the shape of this chamber? I sit in a strange position here on very edge of the bend, not in a left versus right talking at each other. I think it's actually one of the nicest places to speak from here, because sometimes you can see different sides. People, I'm sure, have sat in different locations in this house to compare seats. They're some of the toughest seats. I used to, I've been there. It's nice in some ways, but it has its own disadvantages. There's sometimes lovely being up here up in the gods, the gods of certainty, with the lovely railings behind you. You can have a perch that you can be slightly above it all. But I sometimes think what we've seen, and I'd stand up for, is that ability here to come together, which we've shown in the Brexit approach, that I think has been right. And I think we should hold to it, even in this very difficult, uncertain moment where our position may end up costing us dear. I don't know, no one knows what the House of Commons will do. It does seem to me a lot now depends on what the Labour Party decides to do, because the Conservative Party clearly is divided completely and does not have a majority to be able to act as a government ordinarily would. I mean, I was interested reading again, just quoting people, read Stephen Collins today. I thought it was brilliant. I hope he won't object to me saying this, but he's old enough grey hairs to be able to go back to that history of I had forgotten that Harold Wilson had called a referendum in 1973, was it? And that, as Stephen argued, that tradition in the Labour Party that Harold Wilson, and it would seem Jeremy Corbyn also represents, it comes from a very critical position of the European Union, for some reason to seem to think that the revolution, socialist revolution that they seek, has been impeded by that union. I heard another member of our lady who writes for the New Statesman the other day describing the European Union as the antithesis of what they want because it represents the status quo. And I was kind of thinking to myself as I listened, well, it's the status quo which has brought peace compared to what went before. I quite like that status quo, thank you. And compared to a European history of ongoing murder and mayhem, but they have that in their tradition and it's still there. And I think the really interesting, we've been watching for the last 2.5 years, where's the real heart of the Conservative Party? Clearly the heart of the Conservative Party is pro-European. 2/3 of those, everyone's focusing on the 100 and what was it, 120, 118, those who voted against their own government, but ignoring the fact that the majority of the Tory party voted for it and is still very much in a European tradition. And even some of those 118 are probably similarly inclined, but just voted perhaps out of the desire that maybe by voting against the government they might get a Remain option back. But that is not now seen the issue. The key issue is which way the Labour Party goes, and whether they have ability to do what we sometimes do here, to meet at the bend, if they have a bend in the House of Commons where they might form an arrangement. I'll be honest, I'm just sceptical that that's going to be possible. I mean, I don't know, Tánaiste, I don't think we have a huge involvement in it, because if we did, we would disturb the process. We don't want to interfere. But I'm sceptical. Any softer Brexit option, which would replace the withdrawal agreement, might have the advantage that the compromise that, in a sense, that was within the withdrawal agreement, that came from the customs arrangement being extended from the north across the whole of the UK, which was slightly duplicitous, you might think, would have to be more explicit in whatever sort of arrangement, soft arrangement, whatever, Canadian, Norway plus whatever, would have an acceptance from a sufficient number of Tories that Theresa May's red lines were being crossed, would have to then get agreement from the government to recognise that majority and implement it in European negotiations, which would not be easy, and would have to have a mechanism where the Labour Party was able to help coordinate and organise that. That's not an easy prospect to see. Similarly, the other option, second option, towards a second referendum, while it's the one that our party espouses in Westminster, and we've supported up north and down here, called for the same because we fundamentally want to see the United Kingdom remain within the European Union. But it's hard to see how that can command a majority. I think it's true what people said. The clearly majority of the House of Commons were initially Remainers, but is there now a majority within the House of Commons to be able to push through and organise and coordinate a second referendum, which would have been incredibly difficult to the best of times? I don't know. That depends to a certain extent, it seems to me, on what the numbers are within the Labour Party. Because both those prospects seem so now precarious, it seems to me, particularly in the difficult political situation they've got themselves into, and we all know how sometimes you can get set narratives arise because of what they've gone on there for several months, that it becomes difficult to people to take a real rational step-back assessment of it. I fear that the no-deal scenario is still a real prospect. And as best as I can read and understand the UK constitutional arrangements and governance arrangements and statutory instruments in terms of their standing orders within their parliament, it seems to me that if the Prime Minister, Ms May, decides to hold to that line and not to cross her red lines, and that government cannot coordinate, even though Treasurer might want, as we read in the Telegraph this morning, might want to guarantee no deal, I'm not certain that they might not inadvertently allow the country to fall over the edge. And in that, my real concern, go back to my initial point, it isn't just about the immediate, although we have to legislate extensively for all the immediate technical aspects of it. It's the cost to our political relations with the UK and our societal relations with the UK of the smashing of the relations that would occur in such a no-deal scenario is what really concerns me. I think two things. I think one of the things we have to be careful of in whatever happens here is to make sure, if there are real difficulties come with that we maintain our own calm and cool. We do not get into antagonistic spat in whatever way. We maintain our good relationships. We welcome back the English rugby team here in February, maybe not like in 1973 when they came in a very dark hour and in a brave way, but still we maintain those good relations. And lastly, just in terms of our own, that's one small thought, and I'd be interested, I don't know if the Taoiseach is responding, but I'd be interested to get his response to this suggestion, if it is possible. We had this meeting the other night, and I think the Taoiseach deserves credit for the way in which the opposition have been kept informed. It's part of this bend in the road form of politics, which I think serves us well. The way that the stakeholders in the group have kept in touch with our unions and our business and our universities, and we've held together that position. We had a meeting the other night, and I hope I'm not breaching confidences, but the leader of Sinn Féin asked a valid question around the rights of our citizens, Irish and European citizens in Northern Ireland, in the event of a no-deal crash-out scenario. Well, I have one question back in that regard in terms of how we manage that if it does happen, as well as all the legislation here. It just seems to me that now more than ever, or in those circumstances in 2 or 3 months' time, more than ever, we would need to have an assembly in the Northern Ireland to help manage whatever has to be done, because it will be bloody difficult. And I don't think we should leave that to British civil servants that have no democratic accountability, or indeed House of Commons who are going to be in an incredibly difficult. That's not going to help. Is there any way, Taoiseach, from your perspective, that in some way, as part of our preparations, in an emergency process, and I don't know what it would require. Would it require new assembly elections? Would it require, I don't know what, I'll be honest, because it seems to be an intractable problem. But the one question I have is there any way for us to see a restoration of the assembly so that should the worst crash-out option come to bear, we see that helping in the managing of it, and hopefully in that process we restore good relationship with our unionist neighbours and try and make sure we don't lose all that has been gained since the Good Friday Agreement has been in place by kind of forcing, not forcing, but by restoring political relations to help us manage what would be difficult then. I don't think there shouldn't be recriminations, we shouldn't be pointing fingers, there should be no I told you so's, there should be no retribution in whatever type of way. We should just try and manage the thing. And part of managing it might be an assembly in the north. I don't know if there's any way you see that the Irish government might make that a possibility.